Friends, this morning we are concluding our series called Unwrapping Christmas. And during the Advent season and on Christmas Eve, we unwrapped different gifts that represented the gifts that we received from God. First, we unwrapped the gift of hope, which was represented by the baby Jesus here in the manger. Next, we unwrapped the gift of peace, which we learned that in order for us to have peace in the world, we need to have peace in our hearts first. And so the blue heart represents peace. Next, we unwrapped the gift of joy. And the prayer shawl that I have there on the table represents that joy because it was a gift that was given to me when I was being commissioned as a pastor. And whenever I wrap up in it, I feel joy in my heart. And then the next gift was the gift of love. And instead of taking a gift out of the box, I instead took my sweater off and put it into the box. Because the gift of love inspires us to give of ourselves. And finally, on Christmas Eve, we talked about the gift of the child, which I also then included the gift of unity. And so we talked about how we needed to be, and we do need to be, more unified and less divided in our world and in our churches and in our families. And so the little people that are hugging each other in a circle, those represent our gift of unity. Finally, today we are looking at the gift of faith, and we will be unwrapping that in just a few moments. So today, as we move into the gift of faith, I'm reading from Hebrews chapter 11. Now, faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain did. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks, even though he is dead. By faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away, for before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. Because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek him. By faith, Noah, when warned about things not seen, in holy fear built an ark to save his people. By his faith, he condemned the world and became heir of the righteousness that is in keeping with faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. May God add blessing to the reading, hearing, and understanding of these words. When I was a little girl, we went to church every Sunday. In fact, the only way I could get out of going to church was if I was near death. Well, when we would get to church, my mom would always go into the big church. And by the way, this is a picture of the church that I attended and where David and I were married 38 years ago. Mom would go into that big church and attend worship, while I went into one of the classrooms for Sunday school where we learned about Jesus and I made little crafty things. When people asked me where I went to church, I would say very proudly, I'm a Methodist, even though I had no clue what that meant. And if they asked me if I believed in God, I said, of course. Doesn't everybody? What's interesting, though, is that no one ever asked me if I have faith or if I had faith, probably because I was a child. And had they asked, I wouldn't have known really how to respond, because back then I really didn't know what faith was. So I asked the question, what is faith? Is it the same as belief? No, it's really much bigger, even though they both are tied together with each other. We can believe in God and not have faith in God, but we cannot have faith unless we believe. They are inextricably connected to one another, faith and belief, which I have to admit doesn't really help us with the definition of the term, does it? Well, the author of the book of Hebrews tries to help us with that, and he says that faith is confidence for what we hope for and assurance for what we do not see. Now, at first glance, that might seem to say the same thing, but those two phrases are really very different. The first, says author William Johnson, is a time-oriented phrase that looks toward the future. It is the certainty that hope will become reality, that our hope will become reality. Whereas the second phrase, Johnson writes, is space-oriented and points us in the direction of the present reality of the invisible world. It refers to the confidence we have when we have faith that the things around us that are really real are beyond the sensory, beyond what we can see and touch. In short, faith is confidence in the invisible. Now, I know that sounds like a lot of hocus pocus, doesn't it? But if you're a person of faith, you know what I'm talking about. You know that Johnson's statement is true. If you've experienced firsthand God's activity in your life, then you know that the invisible is real. Reverend John Wright served at a church called Town Center Baptist in Happy Valley, Oregon. And while he was serving there, they were worshiping in a storefront. Well, they finally outgrew that space, and they decided that they needed to have a church building. So they started looking around for one that they could buy, and they found one with a price tag of $27,000. Now, that sounds very reasonable to us, doesn't it? But at the time that they were purchasing it, that was a lot of money. And it didn't help that they didn't have that money. In fact, they had no money with which to buy the church. Still, they believed that God wanted them to have that building. And so they signed a contract and agreed that within 90 days, they would pay cash, $27,000 in cash for the building. Talk about a leap of faith, right? Well, Pastor John said that after they signed the contract, they all started to pray for the money to come in. And after 2 months, not a dime showed up. Then Pastor John was invited to speak at a banquet on the Saturday before the payment was due. When the MC introduced him, he asked Pastor John to say a little bit about his church. And so he told them about the building. He didn't tell them how much they had to pay, but he did tell them that they didn't have the money to buy it. He said, "But we have faith that God will provide." And then he continued with his prepared remarks for the banquet. Afterward, an elderly man introduced himself to Pastor John and said to him, "I'd like to talk to you about something, Pastor. Could you come to my house tomorrow afternoon?" And Pastor John said, "Sure." So the next day, Sunday, he went to the older man's house, and the man asked him to tell more about the church's situation. And after the pastor told him about the building and that they didn't have a penny of the $27,000 they needed by the next day, the man said to him, 10 years ago, I bought some annuities, which just matured about a month ago. I've been praying about what God wants me to do with the money I made, a total of $27,000. And now I know what God wants me to do. If you come by tomorrow at 3 o'clock, I will give you a cashier's check for that amount. So the next day, Pastor John went back to the man's house and picked up that check. And at 5 o'clock, he went to the closing for their building and handed them $27,000 in cash. By faith, that congregation's hope became a reality because the invisible, that which is beyond what we can see and touch, was actively at work. By the way, the sign on the front of the church, if you can't read it, it says, "A place of faith in a world of doubt." Pretty appropriate, isn't it? You know, that's a remarkable story, and it is true. And I wonder, has something like that ever happened to you? Or maybe has it happened to someone you know? Well, the truth is, it actually is happening right here and now at Faith United Methodist Church. Most of you know that our North Education building was leased to a nonprofit organization called Lura Turner Homes some time ago. When we entered into the agreement, we had a lot of renovations to do, which cost us a lot of money. And even though their organization is not fully allowed to be on our campus, they do have their offices in that building. And guess what, friends? We're still not done. Because in order for us to get the right permits so that they can be fully operational here on our campus, both organizations, theirs and ours, have had to jump through a lot of hoops. And one of those hoops is that we have to put fire sprinklers in that building in order to meet the code. Well, in order for that to be affordable, we have to take off the sidewalk covering that surrounds the courtyard. Now, that covering, as many of you know, has been deteriorating for quite some time. And quite frankly, even if we could get by with just restoring it and still meet the fire code, that would be an expensive and labor-intensive project. But taking it off is a huge project, too. Something that we could never do by ourselves. And if we hired a contractor to do it, that, too, would be very expensive. Still, that doesn't change the fact that that sidewalk covering has to go. Then, about a year ago, I learned that the school right behind us, Richard E. Miller, was about to start renovating their campus, and they invited me to meet with them and the contractor that was doing the work. Well, the contractor asked if they could use our property to stage their materials and also use our parking lot during the week so that their workers would have a place to park. I said, sure. But you know, when the light rail was being built, ADOT did the same thing, and they paid us quite handsomely for that privilege. Now, I said to the contractor, I really don't feel comfortable charging you money for this. What if instead we made a deal? We have this little project in our courtyard. And they agreed to take it down at no charge to the church. And they are going to begin that work next month. Faith is the confidence for what we hope for and the assurance about what we do not see. Now, lest we think that having faith only has to do with situations of money, let's go back to the scriptures in Hebrews and look at the heroes of the faith that he describes. First, he mentions Abel, the second son of Adam and Eve. Now, he writes that because Abel brought a better offering than Cain did, that God commended Abel, which made Cain angry, and therefore Cain murdered Abel because of his anger. In spite of that, the writer of Hebrews says, Abel's legacy still lives on because by faith Abel still speaks even though he is dead. His story continues to be told and his faithfulness continues to be celebrated. Next, we hear about Enoch, who we are told did not experience death. Now, the first mention of Enoch is in Genesis 5, in a passage that, quite frankly, if you blink, you'll miss it. He's included in the list of descendants of Adam, beginning with Adam's son, Seth. Seth was the father of Enosh, and he lived to be 912 years old. And then Genesis says he died. Enosh was the father of Kenan, and he lived to be 905. And then Genesis says he died. Kenan was the father of Mahalalel, who lived to be 910. And then Genesis says he died. Mahalalel was the father of Jared. He only made it to 830. Then Genesis says he died. Jared was the father of Enoch, and he celebrated 962 birthdays. Boy, ripe old age, huh? And then Genesis says he died. And then there was Enoch, the father of Methuselah, who at the young age of 365 disappeared because God took him. Notice that with all of the others, they died, but with Enoch, he was taken away. In Hebrews, we read, by faith, Enoch was taken from this life so that he did not experience death. And before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. And without faith, it is impossible to please God. In similar fashion, Abram, who we heard about this morning, was told by God to leave the comfort of his home and go to a place that God would show him. Now, Abram and his family had no idea where they were going, but because of Abram's faith, they obeyed and they left. They had confidence in what they had hoped for and assurance of what they could not see. By faith, they did what God told them to do. And the rest is history. Why are these heroes of the faith important to us? Because they show us that simply believing is not enough. Believing is important, but it's not the same as having faith. Because faith isn't limited to believing. It requires us to earnestly seek God so that everything we do will please God. Unlike doubting Thomas, people of faith believe without seeing. Their faith supersedes any doubts they have about that which is unseen. In fact, faith allows us to infuse the unseen into our very being. Or as David Jeremiah once said, God has given us the gift of faith that we can take what is unseen and make it part of who we are. Now, this transition from belief to faith, that can be a little nebulous. It's not like turning on a light switch. And we certainly cannot say, I have faith, and then it magically becomes a part of who we are. I believe that being a faithful person progresses over time. I also believe that the strength of our faith grows over time. We evolve as people of faith. But there are some things we can do to kind of move the process along. For example, we can hang out with people who are faithful, our own heroes of the faith, and observe how they live out their faith in the things that they do in a faithful way. We can spend more time in prayer and Bible study so we can build or rebuild our relationship with God. And we can behave as if we have faith. In other words, do the things that faith-filled people do, like attending worship every week or working out in the mission field, until we truly understand that the reason we're doing these things is because of our conviction that God is actively working through us. That our actions are really God's actions, accomplished through the things that we do. When we act on our belief by doing the things God wants us to do for each other, we live by what we cannot see. We live by faith. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. These words aren't just a definition of faith. They really are a celebration of faith. They tell us that faith is what we do with our lives, how we live out our belief in God. When we transition from believers to people of faith, our lives are changed for the better. We are transformed. Faith makes us want to be better people and to be the people that God intends us to be. Faith is confidence in what we hope for and assurance about what we do not see. And that is why today our gift box appears to be empty, because it contains the gift that we cannot see, the gift of faith. And when we embrace that gift and put it to work, along with the gifts of hope, peace, joy, and love, we reveal the true Christmas spirit to all people around us. Wouldn't it be nice if we could do that all year long? Amen.